Hello, Manita, can you please start?
Sure, thank you. Namaste, everybody, and a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us on this virtual bridge series. I want to, at this stage, please mention a very warm welcome to our very special guest speakers, to Sunitha Vishwanath and to Salona Lachman. Thank you very much for giving up your evening. We look forward to engaging in fruitful discussion and plotting a way forward for us as a march, for human beings and part of a community. I also want to extend a very warm welcome to Swami Vedanand Saraswati, and as well as to Pandita Arti Shanand. She's the president of the Arya Samaj South Africa. And of course, to my Guruji, Dr. Ravilasji. Warm welcome, everybody. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Let us start with a prayer, please. The Gayatri Mantra in English first. O God, giver of life, the remover of pains and sorrows, bestower of happiness, and the creator of the universe, thou art most luminous, pure, and adorable. We meditate on thee. May thou inspire and guide our intellect in the right direction. Om Bhur Bhuvah Swaha Tatsavitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhyo Yo Nah Prachodayat. Thank you and a warm welcome to you all. Karunapur?
Yeah, I'm on. Namaste to everybody, and thank you, Manita, for that very warm welcome to all of us. Friends, we've been having these webinars for a number of months now, so I think you all know that you all are muted, and basically, if you stop your video, then you conserve the bandwidth and you limit distractions. Please use the chat facility to place your comments and views. The webinar is hopefully going to be participatory, and so you're encouraged to share your views. To speak during the discussion, please unmute yourself. Once you have spoken, please mute yourself. The virtual bridge series was conceptualized by the Arya Samaj Gauteng to share knowledge, better understand challenges facing society, and to grow and develop spiritually. We know we're living in unprecedented times, and so it was important to try and find meaning within the current context. The lectures that we began in this series began on the 1st of May, and in the current series, we're having webinars, which commenced on 28th October and will run through to November 2021. The dates and topics for this has been shared on our Facebook page. The focus of this webinar and series is on reform in religion, revolution in society, and the liberation of mindsets, as set out by Swami Dayananda, the founder of the Arya Samaj. The Arya Samaj led the way with equality for women, education for women, and an end to the caste system. And so we've had a session already on gender and economics. We've had a conversation about who am I, creating the balance between ancestry, heritage, and identity. In December last year, we discussed the developmental state. And then in February, we focused on socioeconomic justice, while the last webinar on the 24th of February was on social cohesion and social justice. Going forward, there would be 2 seminars on Vedic education and spirituality. And then in May, our webinars will hopefully focus on what can we do in South Africa regarding these issues we've discussed in each of the webinars. So please take notes, remember the issues, mull over them, and share your views and contribute to plan the future of the Arya Samaj in South Africa. In May last year, the Arya Samaj joined the Climate Justice Coalition and is a signatory to the Climate Justice Charter, which has been lodged with our parliament in South Africa. In addition, the Arya Samaj has supported the call for a basic income grant. And we know that there were other matters that have come up that we'll need to think about, and especially in terms of developing leadership with the capability to navigate the 21st century. And these may include interfaith engagements for social justice, developing new material based on Vedic literature, and a program for women to be included in the economy. Today, friends, I was invited to a very closed meeting of some 280 people in the country, leaders in the country, and we have launched a statement to defend our democracy. Tomorrow there will be a briefing, and basically there's a call to all organizations, faith-based organizations, civil society, political organizations, to actually have the constitution of our country respected and the democracy strengthened. So let us turn to the content of today's seminar. On the 8th of March, it was International Women's Day. And on the 21st of March, it's going to be Human Rights Day in South Africa. It is hoped that this webinar will provide a renewed focus on women in the Arya Samaj and for women in the Arya Samaj. In 1910, 100 years ago, through the efforts of Clara Zetkin, the German head of the Socialist International, the Second International declared the 8th of March, International Women's Day, as a tribute to women workers of the clothing industry who protested on the 8th of March in New York City for their rights to be in unions and to have a vote. There was a global commitment to equity in society and for inclusion in society. As early as 1913, African women in South Africa had protested the past issues which embodied their disenfranchisement. Following the creation of the ANC Women's League in 1948 and the formation of the Federation of South African Women in 1954, the issues of passes, Bantu education, and the destruction of beer halls dominated the activities of South African women. Among the key activities organized by women were mass demonstrations of August 9th, which became National Women's Day in our country. But it needs to be pointed out that the struggle to get women accepted in the political arena was a long and bitter one. Women were the tea makers, and those who could speak were given some spaces. But it was only after women demonstrated their strength and the ability to mobilize that true political spaces opened up. In 1975, a decade of women was announced by the United Nations following the wave of feminism and the rise of the liberation movement. As we move into the new millennium, women's issues have been redefined to be gender issues, as issues relating to women's status in society and the inequities suffered by women are societal in nature. While most countries have ratified CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, laws that affect women directly, such as customary law, remains incompatible. For women to have full emancipation, it would be necessary to eradicate the traditional practices such as virginity testing, forced marriages, and the so-called honor killings of women considered by families and communities to have committed acts that disgrace their name. These practices are now defined as violations of women's rights. In South Africa, gender-based violence has been highlighted as a pandemic alongside the COVID pandemic. Today, we know that the women's experience of economic rights in the global context is different to the 20th century. Women then came in to join the economy during the war. Now women are subverting wars, looking at being fully empowered and fighting poverty. There is a need for tougher measures to combat domestic violence and the trafficking in women. The current gender struggles are that of domestic violence, child abuse, sexual offenses, the lack of skills and economic and social rights. Why are women criticized for forms of sexual conduct for which men are considered positively? Why do some men sexually abuse their children? Why do some people prefer sexual contact with people of the same sex and some with the other sex? Is sexuality an instinct? Is sexuality socially constructed? What does virginity testing for girls and circumcision for boys have to do with sexuality? These questions need to be answered to deepen the gender commitment adopted in South Africa and in the world. The practice of sexual double standards needs to be deconstructed, openly discussed and debated, and only then will the inalienable rights, human rights enshrined in the South African Constitution be realized and a non-sexist society will be in practice. Sexuality is a constant in the subordination of women and has become the root of stability in heterosexual societies and serves to sustain homophobia in society. A lack of openness leads to gender imbalances and is perpetuated in our society. It also reinforces sex role stereotyping and patriarchal attitudes, and it develops a culture of intolerance and prejudice. If the culture of human rights is to become a living thread in our lives, a part of the warp and weft of the social fabric, a focus on sexuality, on the values that will ensure the practice of upholding rights must be secured through open and honest debates to realize the equity of the sexes and the equality for women and the respect for the LGBTQ community. To cover our topic, gender rights are human rights, we have Sunitha Viswanathan, who hails from the USA and is the founder of the Human Right of Hindus for Human Rights. She is the board chair for Women for Afghan Women. For her work on this, Sunitha was awarded the Feminist Majority Foundation's Global Women's Rights Award in 2011. Sunitha co-founded Sadhana in 2011 to mobilize Hindu Americans to connect with their faith and with social justice and human rights issues. She serves on Sadhana's executive. She was honored by President Obama at the White House in 2015 as a champion of change for her work in Sadhana. Sunitha, good morning to you, and thank you so much for logging in. I now hand the platform over to you. The topic that Sunitha is going to talk to us about is gender rights, human rights, and the unfolding struggle for equality in the 21st century.
Thank you. Thank you so much, my sister. It's a very grand title. What I'm going to do is just tell you my story. Um, that's the best I can do. I'm an activist, and yeah, my story is really the only thing I can share. So, as you just said, I'm the co-founder of three nonprofits: Women for Afghan Women, 20 years old; Sadhana, 10 years old; Hindus for Human Rights, about 1.5 years old, 1.5 years old. And so my work and my life have sort of followed that trajectory. Um, I was born in India, in South India. I was born into an upper caste family. And when I was a very young child in India, I had this experience of, on the one hand, as a girl, being very empowered. My ideas were welcome. I was beloved. I was a happy child. But at the same time, I was a child who lived in a home in India, in Madras, where untouchability was practiced. And this is something, as a little girl, I spoke up against. And those ideas were welcome, but the practice took a long time to change in my extended family. The other thing is, thinking back to my childhood, as empowered and loved as I was also given a negative message, which is, which haunts us as women, even as adult women, which is that as a young child, I wore glasses and I was dark skinned compared to others in the family. And there's negative messages, associated with how you look, which also formed part of my childhood. And we're talking in Women's History Month about gender rights and women's rights. And we should think about how we raise our girls. I grew up to be a women's rights activist. I moved from India as a baby to England, and then eventually to the States as a teenager. And so most of my adult life has been right here in the States, although I have been going back to India very regularly. And I worked in several women's organizations, eventually 20 years ago, before 9/11, to co-found this organization, Women for Afghan Women. I did that work as a secular person, as a human being. I happened to be from India. I happened to be from the Hindu tradition. I never, like so many, I never felt uncomfortable being a Hindu. I was always, if you asked me, I would tell you I was Hindu. But in my public life, I wouldn't necessarily say it. And this is true of so many Hindus in the diaspora and in India, where we show up to the things we believe in, we show up to life, and privately we are Hindu, and publicly we may not identify as Hindu. And I think the reason for that, there are many reasons. I think the reasons that I've come across are mainly two. One is some sense of discomfort with issues such as caste, make us more comfortable just identifying, as secular people, as activists, and not saying we are Hindu. That might be part of it. The other part of it, I think, is that India was born a secular nation, and Hindus are the majority in India. And so I think that we are, many of us who are justice oriented, are beholden to this notion of India as a pluralistic, secular country. And somehow, sadly, identifying as Hindu has become synonymous with identifying with the Hindu right wing. And I think a lot of people just prefer to, it's obvious that we're Hindu when we show up because of our name. And then it's better to be quiet about that. Now, I will tell you as my story unfolds that these days, for a decade now, I have been identifying as a Hindu. And this has been my work for the last decade, is connecting my Hindu faith to my social justice work in the world. So we'll get there. Women for Afghan Women was founded 20 years ago, and it was before 9/11. And I was the main instigator for the founding of this organization. As we were, and the reason that I became very interested in human rights in Afghanistan was it comes back to what I was taught was my Hindu faith. My parents raised me to think that my faith, my dharma, saw the world as one. This notion of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is from, from the Rig Veda. It's our oldest scripture. It was the tenet, it was the pillar of my upbringing, that there's no difference between me and somebody else, that we are equally, our lives are equally valid and have equal worth in the world, not just in the world, but in the eyes of God. And so this is something, from my youngest years. In fact, when I was a small child, when I was arguing with my family about the untouchability that was practiced in my extended family, I knew Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam even as a child. And that's how deep this goes for me. So when I was very alarmed about Taliban taking over Afghanistan in the mid-90s, I wanted to do something about it. And so I was living in New York, and I started to look for Afghans who were concerned about what was happening in their country. And I was working in a foundation, and all I wanted to do was give them a grant. Over time, over the course of a year, it turned out that the only organizations in the States that were working on human rights in Afghanistan were led by American women, white American women, and other American women, not Afghan women. And so I really wanted to fund an organization that was led by Afghan women. And so the conversations, the meetings went on, looking for such an organization. And we ended up founding that organization because it didn't exist in the States or in the diaspora at the time. At that time that Women for Afghan Women was being founded, there's one night that I come back to over and over again. It was a night when an Afghan woman leader called me and spent something like 2 hours on the phone with me, begging me to leave her women alone, leave her people alone. You are not Muslim, you are not Afghan, you don't know what you're doing. You will do more harm than good, is what she said. And I was 20 years younger. I was 20 years less secure and confident. When we hung up the phone, I was in tears. And I for a moment, didn't know what to do, but then immediately knew what to do. I looked at my kids, who were at that time 6 and 3. And by looking at them, I knew that the world where I couldn't do something about human rights violations in any part of the world, that wasn't the world where I could raise my children. It just wasn't. And I made the decision to keep doing this work. And I know there are people who disagree with me, but I feel sure in my heart that it was right to continue doing this work. It doesn't matter that I'm not Muslim and I'm not Afghan. It's okay that I co-created Women for Afghan Women. The leaders of Women for Afghan Women have always been Afghan women. And those of us who support that work and lift up that work are from all parts of the world. And this is my vision for the world. And it comes back to that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I want my children and myself and all of us to feel not just an ownership of this world and this planet, but a responsibility to it. And today, Women for Afghan Women is the largest women's rights organization serving Afghan women. We are active on the ground in 14 provinces in Afghanistan, and we want to be we're expanding right now to 3 more provinces in the south. We also are very active in New York City, where we were founded, and the diaspora, the Afghan diaspora. And we are a grassroots organization. Anywhere you take a cross section of our work, you will find a grassroots organization where the staff represent the community served, the province served, the borough in New York City served. We hire locally. The other thing about our organization being grassroots is that we take the best parts of Afghan culture and bring it into our work. So when a person shows up with a human rights violation, the method that we use, our theory of change, is grassroots and comes from the Afghan community. And there's something that's done in the Afghan community called jirga. It's basically a mediation meeting. And so when it's usually a woman, sometimes it's a man, when the person shows up who needs Women for Afghan Women's help, we form a circle, which that person chooses who is in that circle. It's some of our staff, it's their spouse, parent, uncle, imam, elder, grandparent, whoever they trust and want, siblings, whoever they want in that circle. And together we problem solve the situation. And this is what we do in Afghanistan. This is what we do in Queens, New York. And this methodology means that the women from the community trust us. And they come and they see themselves reflected in the staff, and they see their culture, which they love and they have been raised in, reflected in the way that we work. And there's so much more to say about Women for Afghan Women, but we have 1,000 staff today. And that staff is half women and half men. And it's an organization which will keep growing, inshallah, as we say, as long as security in Afghanistan permits us to. I'm going to move quickly into the work I do in the Hindu community. Working for so many years with Afghan brothers and sisters, over and over again, I would ask the Afghan staff and other volunteers, why do you do this work when it's so dangerous? Why do you show up to this work when you know you may not come home any given day? And the answer over and over again is, and was throughout the years, it is my duty as a Muslim. And as a person who was raised Hindu and feels very grounded in my Hindu faith, I would ask the question, where are the Hindus who put themselves in harm's way for what is right? And I would only find those Hindus whose faith motivates them to do this kind of dangerous work for human rights in history. Gandhiji, who spent so much time in South Africa, and so many others, not just Gandhiji, but so many others throughout history. And I couldn't find such Hindus in our time, in my time. And I hungered for that voice because there was injustice all over, all kinds of social justice issues in the US, where interfaith groups step up and there's rarely a Hindu among them. And in India, I know that we're talking 10, 15 years ago that this question came for me. And 10 years ago, I started on this path. This Hindutva movement in India was, it's 100 years old, but it wasn't as strong as it is now 10 years ago. And today it's reigning in India. It's the regime in India. So given the rise of the Hindu right, I wanted a Hindu platform, a Hindu movement where people like me can say, no, my Hinduism tells me Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and there wasn't one in our time. And so what I've been doing over the past decade is building such a platform. And there's, again, I know time, I don't want to speak much more. I can answer more questions in question and answer, but there's many stories to tell from my journey over the past 10 years of building a progressive Hindu platform. Sadhana, Coalition of Progressive Hindus, focuses on social justice issues in the States, and Hindus for Human Rights, which is newer, focuses on human rights and religious freedom in India. I want to end by saying that in my life, the person in my time who lived and manifested the kind of brave, courageous, life-threatening Hindu presence in the world, not just for our own community, but for justice wherever justice is denied, was Swami Agnivesh. And I became very close to Swami Agnivesh and also wonderful Swami Vedanand Saraswati. And we met and became close while facing the fire of death threats against Swami Agnivesh when we were together in the Parliament of World Religions in Toronto a few years ago. And it is such a sad thing that Swami Agnivesh is not here with us today. He would have been in this webinar with us, giving his blessing. But we do have Swami Vedanand, and Swamiji, I am so honored and proud and glad to be connected with you. I'll end here, and there was so much more to say, but hopefully we can talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunita. And I'm glad you remembered Swami Agnivesh. In fact, I heard you speak at it, but I also had been informed by him of the good work you are doing. So I think that's really great. Friends, we have Salona with us, Salona Lachman, who hails from Durban, but is now resident in Cape Town. She studied at UKZN and has a master's in law from New York University. She's a senior lecturer at the law faculty in UCT. Salona was active in the formation and activities of the Arya Samaj in Gauteng. So it's really nice to welcome somebody who founded the Gauteng Arya Samaj to share some ideas on the platform. Salona is going to speak about the South African Constitution and social justice, the relevance and importance of this for the Arya Samaj in South Africa. Salona.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Namaste to all. It's wonderful to be here, wonderful to be invited. Thank you to Auntie Karuna and my Auntie Ujala Mosi, for inviting me to talk at this webinar today. I feel very privileged to do so. It's also wonderful to see so many familiar names. Growing up in Durban, these names were very famous. Going to Hawan Satsang every week, going to the Hindi Shiksha Sang activities as well. So it's wonderful to see all these names, and namaste to all. So today I'm going to be talking about gender justice, human rights, social justice, and our constitution. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, it says that the permission needs to be given to me to share the screen. Okay, there we go. All right, please let me know if there are any difficulties. Okay, all right. So today I'm going to be talking about the Constitution and social justice and the relevance and importance for the Arya Samaj. So to start, I thought I would begin with a quote from the epilogue of the interim constitution of our country. So this was the first constitution prior to the final constitution in 1996. And the epilogue says, the Constitution is a historic bridge between the past of a deeply divided society characterized by strife, conflict, untold suffering and injustice, and a future founded on the recognition of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence and development opportunities for all South Africans, irrespective of color, race, class, belief, or sex. So today I want us to have the image of a bridge in our minds. Our Constitution was created on the premise that it would be a bridge between a deeply divided society, an unjust society, to a society founded on the recognition of human rights, democracy, and social justice. And it's this idea of a bridge which, of course, has quite a lot of significance and importance to this series of talks, virtual bridge building. And so we need to think about, well, what does a bridge signify? It signifies movement, energy, change, going from one place to another. It also signifies, in a symbolic way, transformation. The transformation of our society, the transformation of our communities, our families, and indeed ourselves. And so I'm going to come back to this idea of a bridge during the course of this talk. So where is our destination? Our Constitution, with its cherished Bill of Rights, is the blueprint or roadmap to transformation, to transform our society. But the nature of this bridge, our Constitution, is ever changing. This destination is constantly changing. We are always looking to transform. We are always in the process of transformation. It is not about being static. It is not about having a destination per se in mind. We have to think of this bridge as being a never-ending bridge. We need to have the mindset of being critical critical of our long-held assumptions, critical of what we hold to be true and right. We need to constantly ask ourselves the question, is this a path towards a just society? Who are we excluding? We should never be complacent about it. And so Justice Pius Langa, back in 2006, spoke about the fact that when we think of this bridge, we should not think about the destination. We should think about the journey. It is the journey which is important. And essentially, we are journeying towards a just society. And so when we speak of this concept of social justice, what does it even mean? It means, in my view, that justice in society goes beyond superficial notions of fairness and right and wrong. It's about social, economic, and political equality. It's about true equality. It's about equality which endures. And importantly, it's about asking ourselves the question, who is excluded? Who is not sitting at the table? Who is on the margins of society? It's about ensuring that all have equal opportunities and privileges within our society. At the heart of any true movement to create a socially just society is the drive to bring in those who are on the margins. Melinda Gates speaks quite prolifically about this in her book, The Moment of Lift, where she says that in order to transform our societies, we need to empower women. And it's about looking at who is on the margins, who is not sitting at the table. So let's talk a little bit about how the Constitution is this vehicle or an instrument to promote social justice and the empowerment of women. So we know that it is women who are on the margins of society, specifically poor women of color. This is the case in South Africa, as it is in many parts of the world. And the Constitution tries to empower women in various ways. It tries to prohibit discrimination in all spheres of life. It tries to ensure that women are afforded human dignity, that women should not be discriminated against purely on the basis of their sex or gender. So just to have a look at a few provisions of the Constitution, we have the core value of the Constitution, the right to human dignity in Section 10. And of course, I've included Section 15 here because we're talking about the role of a faith-based organization, the role of the Arya Samaj. So freedom of religion, belief, and opinion. Of course, like all provisions in the Constitution, it is not an absolute right. You can't use your right to freedom of religion to promote discrimination. And then the right to equality, Section 9, a core value of our Constitution, and it prohibits discrimination on listed grounds. And I've just pasted these listed grounds on the slide: race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, and birth. And the state is not allowed to discriminate on these grounds, and neither are individuals. So the Constitution has what we call vertical and horizontal application. So it applies in individuals' relationship with the state, as well as when people interact with each other. So it's not just about what the state can or cannot do. We as individuals, as members of organizations, are not allowed to breach the rights in the Constitution. And I'm going to ask us this question: is the law enough? And of course, by now you would know that the way this talk is going, I'm going to suggest that the law is not enough. The law is not enough to change thousands of years of ingrained gender prejudice. The law is not going to be enough to undo that. Even the most woke among us, and I'm using the term that my students often use, even the most woke among us, women included, may not be able to see our own prejudice. We may not be able to see the prejudice within ourselves. And I say this, when we speak of gender equality, when we speak of gender rights, we often think that men are the only perpetrators. And I think we should also remember that often women are the foot soldiers of patriarchy. And we have to check ourselves in that process as well. So the law, I believe, is not enough. And I think what's very important is for us to recognize the role of faith-based organizations, of grassroots movements, of civil society organizations at promoting the rights of the Constitution, to ensure that as much as the Constitution tries to transform society from the top down, it is these important organizations that play the role of transforming society from the bottom up. So that's the role of the Arya Samaj, and it has a key role to play in this, in changing attitudes and in helping to undo thousands of years of ingrained prejudice. Of course, it's not going to happen overnight. Now, we know that women and girls are the most vulnerable members of our society. They are politically, financially, and socially disenfranchised. And the Arya Samaj has an important role to play in empowering women and girls and in changing the hearts and minds of people. And that's the difficult work. Changing the hearts and minds of people, changing your own heart and mind. That is the true difficult work that has to be done. And the benefits to society are multiple. So just quoting Melinda Gates, she says, from high rates of education, employment, and economic growth to low rates of teen births, domestic violence, and crime, the inclusion and elevation of women correlates with the signs of a healthy society. So there's even research to back this up, that by empowering women, you are ensuring a better society for all. So what can be done? And so, of course, this is just my stab at what an organization like the Arya Samaj can do. And I think to start with, we need to begin with small acts of, I've called it organizational introspection, a very fancy term. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we need to stop and look at ourselves and look at the organization itself. We need to look at the day-to-day activities, at who is sitting at the table, who makes the decisions, how is this reflected? What does it look like to others? It's also about, I think, actively bringing women and girls into the core circles of the organization, and about creating awareness among the boys and men of the organization. So it's about creating awareness of gender equality in families. I think it's pointless having a discussion about gender equality and human rights without involving men in the discussion. As important as it is, as Sunita ji mentioned earlier, as important as it is for us to think about how do we raise our girls, we need to equally think about how do we raise our boys. What do our sons see on a daily basis in their homes, in the communities, at satsang, etc.? Are they surrounded by women who are leading full and productive lives? What are they observing? What are they taking in? And those little things, I think, are really important. We shouldn't underestimate the power of role modeling. And it's those little changes that I think make a huge difference. What are children seeing in the home? And how do we, as an organization, create awareness about what is going on in the home? And of course, these are difficult things. I mean, how do you change thousands of years of prejudice? It's not going to happen overnight, but we need to at least make a start. We need to think about, are the women the ones who are making the tea and snacks after satsang, while the men sit and wait to be fed? Is that what our boys are seeing? It's in those small acts, I believe, that true change can happen. So what can be done to continue with that discussion? I think we need to also ask ourselves the difficult and critical questions. As much as those little acts are important, I think we need to also think about the bigger picture. We need to ask ourselves, do our cultural practices and traditions exclude? And that's, of course, a very contentious question. It's a difficult act to do. It's our gut reaction to be defensive and to say there's nothing to change. But we need to stop and truly look at it from an outsider's perspective. We may realize that what we have long held to be the correct way of doing things, or the only way of doing things, is actually problematic. So we have to also get rid of the "that's how things are done" type of mentality. We need to, of course, celebrate our achievements. And of course, you know, the Arya Samaj has a long and proud history of promoting gender equality. And this, you know, of course, this long and proud history is something to be celebrated. But it should not make us complacent. It should not make us think that, look, we've reached the end of the bridge. We've reached that just society. There's nothing more to be done. That is what the late Chief Justice Pius Langa was concerned about. He was concerned about South Africans becoming complacent, the danger of believing that we've reached that holy ground, that there's nothing more to be done. So we need to constantly challenge ourselves. And then, just to quote Swami Vivekananda's words, there's no chance for the welfare of the world unless the condition of woman is improved. It is not possible for a bird to fly on only one wing. There is no hope for that family or country where there's no estimation of women, where they live in sadness. For this reason, they have to be raised first. And so in being critical and in thinking through these ideas, we need to also ask questions like, what about gender rights beyond the rights of women? What about gender on the spectrum? Does the organization respect the rights of those who consider themselves to be on the spectrum, the LGBTQI community? Are they protected within the organization? Are they afforded the same privileges and opportunities as others? And so we need to constantly ask ourselves these questions. And so to end, I just want to challenge us. I want us to tell ourselves that we will be more introspective in our homes, importantly, in ourselves, in our organizations, at the workplace, as we walk on this bridge towards a socially just society. Let us not stop for too long to congratulate ourselves. Let us always remember that the work is never done. Thank you.
Thank you, Salona. Friends, we have one more speaker, and she is Ntato Menyuku, who is the Group Executive on Government Relations, Stakeholder Management, and Regulatory Affairs at Eskom. She's the chairperson also of the South African Maritime Safety Authority and is a facilitator in Women in Energy forums. She holds 2 master's degrees in management, one on energy leadership and the other on city planning and urban design. Ntato is going to take us back to where Sunita left us. She's going to talk of her experiences in navigating the modern world and the challenges in work and family life for women. Ntato.
Thank you, Karuna, and thank you to the previous speakers and your meaningful and insightful input. You know, when Karuna approached me to speak on the panel, I was like, well, what contribution can I give? I'm not an academic on gender issues. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a writer. I'm just a woman who has experienced of the full range of gender challenges from the perspective of being young, being Black, being urban, having been raised in exile, having been put into private schools, being a single mother of 3 children from 3 different fathers, being divorced, being an executive, being a leader. And I thought I would share really what I find to be the reality and the practice and experience of gender versus the rights and the human rights. In my experience, the real issue is how relations are structured in the workplace, in families, in communities, in society, and in partnerships across race, class, sexual orientation, and other aspects of identity. And it raises me to ask a number of questions. Are women authentically willing to bridge racial, cultural, class, sexual orientation, and other identity divides? Or have we relinquished ourselves to our conditioning to other women who are not like us? If we see a woman suffering, do we still assume it's her fault? It's her lot in life. That's what happens with those type of women. I must say that as a single Black mother of 3 children, being perceived as a threat to every layer of patriarchy has meant navigating the difficulties of allying with other women when the conditioning is to socially ostracize others who choose their personal integrity, the safety of themselves and their children over being married or partnered or validated in a double income household. Even I, though, must admit that even I have struggled and had to challenge my own self-limiting belief systems, and I'm not finished, because it's an everyday battle about understanding how I've been conditioned to subvert myself and subvert other women. Least of all is, I must say, the biggest self-limiting belief system that I didn't realize that I had so deeply ingrained in myself was this notion that you must be chosen and you must be validated externally by a man, by others, in order to be considered a full woman. And so as one of the unchosen and discarded mothers of, I call them, at some point I even called them licorice all sorts. It was a long journey of being self-aware, of focusing on self-love and exercising self-care daily. And I raise these issues because when we talk about the realities and practice of gender empowerment and gender rights, how many of us have been conditioned to be self-aware, to focus on self-love, and to exercise self-care daily, so that we are not giving from emptiness, we're giving from our overflow, and that being full and having overflow is paramount. So our dilemma as women is, how do we ensure that we don't continue what previous generations have accepted as the status quo? Considering that previous generations had to deal with very different socioeconomic circumstances than we did, although some of those socioeconomic dynamics still exist for many women, but not for all of us. This requires that we challenge our own conditioning and how we have been conditioned to disempower and dehumanize ourselves and other women in order to enable and to perpetuate the patriarchy. And both women have spoken about this in today's call. So what we know is that women reproduce patriarchy through social sanction, through tone policing, through judging and othering other women. What we know is that many of us don't challenge our own conditioning to be patriarchal princesses, especially when it benefits us at the expense or disproportionately to the lot of other women. And what this means is we need to challenge these conditionings, which requires some level of self-awareness. Some of the social conditions that many of us across many cultures and religions, many societies, many races have been raised with is the culture of silence, the culture of no transparency, the culture of no visibility, which is based on a belief system that women must be long-suffering and the absorbers of trauma, the absorbers of of dysfunction in order to create an environment that is safe and enabling for others, but at the woman's expense. And these are just some of the conditionings that I find similar across women of all races, of all cultures, of all nationalities, of all sexual orientations. Another conditioning we have, which is, comes on the back of what I've just spoken about, is this thing that many of us are raised with, that women and the girl child, the needs of women and the girl child come below the needs of societies, communities, and families. Yet we are supposed to be the custodians. We are supposed to be the ever-ready battery on which societies, families, and communities, and even societies draw upon. We also need to understand, though, that one of the things I found in my journey of self-care, self-awareness, and self-love is that standing up for, validating, and protecting ourselves, our children, and other women comes with institutionalized violence, emotional violence, psychological violence, sexual violence, and financial violence at an interpersonal, familial, communal, social, and institutional level. And so we are a society that has been designed and groomed to manage women through violence at all levels. At the same time, I think we need to consider that women have rights, but they are also oppressing themselves, as I've said, through self-limiting belief systems, through fear, through the need to be rescued and provided for, as if we are still conforming with belief systems that women are children. There's also the reality that independence, self-belief, agency, and self-expression, in other words, personal freedoms, come at a cost. Although we have political freedom, and perhaps some of us have economic freedom, do we truly have the freedom to be our true and authentic selves without being exposed to any form of violence? Another self-limiting belief system I've had to grapple with is the idea of being a superwoman and having everything. And in my experience, as in my multiple leadership roles, as a board chairperson, as a member of executive in a state-owned entity, as a mother, as a former wife, I've come to learn that we can't have everything, primarily because women are being dealt with double standards, because innovation, creativity, and bringing change is always suspect and suspicious, and always dealt with suspiciously. We're constantly having our credentials and our right to be leaders challenged, even if in our own households. Most of you would have heard the term that you can be a leader out there, but when you get home, you're not a leader. And even if a woman is there by her own merit, if we choose in some environments if we refuse to not be a token and to not be driven and controlled, then we are subjected to forms of violence, including being stereotyped, being tone policed, and being shamed as aggressive, as feisty, all very genderized terms for independent-minded women. So navigating labeling, such as aggressive, feisty, bullish, and constantly having your competence challenged by different standards than men, does really challenge how comfortable it could potentially be to have everything. And to a degree, I do understand why women get tired, because ultimately we can't just exist in our own right and in our own legitimacy and in our own authenticity. That existence is constantly seen relative to men and other women. So being self-aware, and what I've learned in my journey is that being self-aware, being self-expressive, being unapologetic about occupying space just because you can, means that one has to cultivate a very thick skin for the resultant attacks that will come from both men and women. And so when we say we must challenge our belief systems, self-limiting belief systems, part of it is challenging how we respond to those who are authentically occupying their space unapologetically. Do we celebrate them? Do we despise them? Do we shame them? Or are we able to engage in our own right and see them as sisters in a sisterhood? As a mother, I must say that raising the girl child, I have 3 girls. I've been blessed with 3 girls for my anti-patriarchy views. But raising the girl child to not repeat what previous generations has done requires digging deep into motherhood every day. It requires being intellectually and emotionally honest every single day. I recently had an incident with one of my children where her best friend, who happens to be a white boy, threw a log at her at school, and then she threw one back, but the teacher only saw her throw the log, and then the teacher grabbed her, squeezed her hand, pulled her out of the classroom, left her in a classroom, and effectively reprimanded her. And the teacher's view was that my child, girl child, shouldn't retaliate against boys. And this is not how I raise my children. I raise my daughters to not accept any form of microaggression and to challenge anything, any behavior that undermines or dehumanizes or strips them of their peace and sense of well-being. Now, here's the irony. It took me about 24 hours to realize that a teacher manhandling a child in a school environment was assault. And so I had to sit and realize that it took me a whole day to realize that my child had been assaulted. And then of course I went to research, what does assault mean? Because I could feel it in my gut, but I had cognitive dissonance because I didn't have a word for what I felt as a mother my child had gone through. And I had to research the word assault, and I came in the SAPS definition, South African Police Service, any activity that instills fear in another is a form of assault. But I was shocked with myself that I didn't know that that was a form of assault, and that I didn't instantly know that my child had been at risk. It took 24 hours to do that. And then, of course, I laid a criminal charge against this teacher, and I'll be removing my kids from that school. But that's the point I'm trying to refer to again, that in order to respond and engage with authenticity, with self-awareness and unapologetically, it does sometimes mean that one ends up having to be ostracized from the very spaces that we seek sanctuary in, even if it's schools for our children. So we often and always have to challenge our own preconceptions and unconsciousness as about mothering, specifically about mothering when we are raising girls. And the importance of nurturing their individualism is something that could potentially be quite a challenge for us as women if our own individualism hasn't been nurtured, having been brought up by previous generations who did not frame us and nurture us as individuals, and who raised us in their own image rather than let us self-discover who we were for ourselves. So one of my biggest learnings as a mother is learning that my daughters are not proxies for me, and they're not for me to live vicariously through. And that in fact, for all of their feistiness, for all of their character, mine is not to suppress it and repress it, but to channel it for them. I think the last, I'm almost at the end of my view here, but I do want to speak about misogynoir and the importance of having a language to frame our experiences and to talk about our experiences. And as a survivor of gender-based violence, I only came across the term misogynoir about 18 months ago. And this is the racism that's specifically targeted to Black women. And I had not understood and seen this. I had always felt there was a disproportional allocation of how it worked. But suddenly articles started coming out around Serena Williams and how she was being treated in the sports world and in the tennis fraternity. And suddenly this language of misogynoir came to light for me. Now, the importance of language and how this links to human rights is one cannot be aware of the violation if there's cognitive dissonance between what you're experiencing and the ability to articulate it. And so terms such as tone policing or activities such as focusing on the visual representation of women, their bodies, their weight, their hair, the color of their skin, and not their minds and their hearts. These sort of activities are part and parcel of misogynoir. And I think the more as women we speak about it and develop a language for it, the more we'll be empowered to call it out and to deal with it. And to deal with institutionalized gendering and misogynoir in the workplace, in schools, on public transport, at church, at the airport, in our families, and in our broader social circles. So I must say that it is a personal challenge to exercise our gender rights and our human rights, but that means challenging our own conditioning. And the first step, I believe, for women is to honestly and deliberately deconstruct the artificial barriers and conditioning that we have been raised with, and to start having conversations around our experience so we can find the commonalities and the synergies. And to just sum off, I mean, my relationship with Karuna is such a relationship. And whenever I think of it, I'm both humoured and blessed at the same time, because Karuna came into my space as someone who's an older peer, not part of my generation, an Indian woman. I had never really worked with Indian women before. And she came in with zero judgment about this young Black woman who was a leader and leading a board at the time. And I suppose my ability and her ability to bridge the divide around race, around culture, around age, around the different cities that we came from, around historical significance relative to our birth date and born freeze, the ability to bridge that gap has enabled us over the years to form a relationship that I could only ever describe as humane. And I think that curiosity, common purpose, shared values can all be discovered if we are willing to engage each other across these divides as human beings, rather than judging and dismissing each other based on our identity and othering. I'll leave my input there.
Thank you, Ntato. Indeed, we all need to find our voices. And I think the majority women in most countries also need to find their voices. And you've provided us, and so has Salona and Sunita, you've all provided us some very good material to think about. Friends, we now open for participation. So if anybody has a view to share, please raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak.
Hi.
Hi, please go ahead.
This is more to Salona. You speak about social justice and the Constitution. And now, as an individual here in South Africa, we have all the right things in the Constitution. It's probably one of the best in the world. But how do we marry that constitution now when with the current events right now that's happening in South Africa? I mean, as Karuna alluded to, we have COVID-19 as a pandemic, and next side by side there we have gender-based violence. So having a document like the constitution, and you pose a question, is the law enough? And I'm quite concerned that our constitution is not working for the woman here in South Africa. Is there a comment from Salona?
Sure, thanks, Bhuvesh. Do we have any further comments, questions?
Okay, I'll take the other one again. Hello?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Also, if anyone in the panel, recently there was some comment from the Vatican. I mean, obviously the Pope is the head of the Vatican. And he doesn't seem to be very impressed with this LGBTI and same-sex marriage and things that are related to that. Is there a comment on that? How do we change that mindset if the Pope himself, being the head, a leader, how will people on the ground, lower levels, start changing their mindset? It's a challenge. A comment?
Okay, Bhuvesh, we're going to take all the questions and then the panel will respond. So basically, let's hear any more comments, any more points. I know a lot of people have said excellent presentations. It seems like our speakers have blown everybody's minds open. And there are many comments on excellent presentations. And there is something, I think Umesh raised, that it's same message coming from 3 different angles. I think that denotes the complexity of the issue. Are there any further comments from people, questions from people?
Yes, Karuna, it's Shanil.
So go ahead, Shanil.
I suppose always for me, as you would know, it's obviously individually, everyone needs to do something. So every single person has a responsibility to improve the situation in some way or the other by changing their behavior. What else can be done, I suppose? Is it purely individuals? Because obviously what you're going to find is possibly the majority of the individuals will be uninterested, disinterested, or maybe even negative. You can't do much about those who are negative, but certainly the disinterested. What can we do?
Okay. Jala, is your mic now working?
Hi, Karuna, and good evening,
Hi.
everybody. I do apologize for missing your presentation, Sunita. I just flew into Cape Town this evening and I made sure I connected via Zoom, but I couldn't obviously listen. But I did catch parts of Salona's presentation and Ntato's presentation. And I just want to touch on 2 things. Firstly, that the conversation has to happen. We cannot wait for the disinterested to be interested to take the conversation forward. Second is the conditioning that prevails, and what are the circumstances around the conditioning, and how, as an organization, where Salona mentioned organizational introspection, what does that actually mean to us as members of the Arya Samaj, and how, what are the implications of this organizational introspection, and how do we challenge the conditioning? Because it doesn't start with the mass, it starts with an individual. And what is it as South Africans, where we take our cue from this really noble document, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? How do we incorporate that into our lives? How do we make it a reality? It's an aspirational document. How many of us can truly say that we've actually studied it and understood the implications of it in terms of our lives and the way we take it forward, particularly around gender, the gendered roles, and the understanding within a cultural context what does it mean to be equal as men and women? How do we challenge the stereotypical thinking and the entrusted roles that prevail in a culture and society? And these are just some of the points of thoughts that have been running in my head as I was listening in. And maybe we need to have much more robust conversations. The fact that we started it tonight, and let us continue with it.
Okay. Thank you, Ujala.
Karuna, could I just
Sure, go ahead, Umesh.
Yeah. Good evening, to all the speakers, and thanks for the very, very vibrant discussion on these different issues. You know, my first question, maybe to Sunita, is around this dangerous trend of the creep of reckless nationalism that's pervading the world, and making us building walls in between communities and different types of people. And how does one stem this tide? Because it seems that many of the people that are guilty of this have their minds shrink-wrapped in false nationalism. So, you know, for me, I see elements of it coming up in South Africa, which is very, very dangerous. And we've come through a long road with apartheid. And if anywhere in the world that's not appreciated, it's the citizens of South Africa, that some of them, that is, that are leaning that way. So I find it very, very hard to handle. And how do we challenge that? Thanks.
Thanks, Umesh. I think perhaps we could actually ask the panelists to respond. So maybe we'd start with you, Sunita.
Sure. Yeah, I actually, all the questions were so, relevant and timely. I think the first, if I can remember them, I think the first one was about Constitution, is that right?
Yes.
And I just, as I was listening, I mean, I hear that all of you in South Africa are asking, doing the introspection of, we have this aspirational document, and what do we do to make that a reality in our lives? And it just makes me think of, we just went through 4 years of, I don't know what to describe the 4 years we just went through in the States under Trump, but just really grateful that, that we have put that behind us and are trying to inch forwards back into something that's sane. But here too, the Constitution is an aspiration, especially if you are from, a poor community, immigrant community. And so I would say, and then I'm also inspired that in India, the country where a lot of my focus is right now, in many of these protests, whether it's farmers' protests or a year ago, the anti-CAA protests, a lot of what happens in these protests is that people read the preamble to the Indian Constitution, that we don't have to go much further than that to see that what's just so simply written isn't being respected or held up. So, I think that in these countries, we are lucky enough to have a constitution that we can stand by. And of course, it's not perfect. Whenever we talk about the Constitution and Hindus for Human Rights, somebody points out that even the Constitution doesn't have everything that we want, but it's a benchmark, and we are falling short of it. So at least we can aspire. And I think it was Saloni Ji who said, about the introspection that's required within our institutions. And one of the people who asked a question brought it down to the individual level. I really believe that, this thing of if you build, they will come. At the end of the day, all we have is we wake up and we have this day that we are given, thank God. And so if we can make the most of that day, each one of us, and try to live, you know, according to whatever truths we, believe in, and be the best person we can. What more can we do than that? And there's a lot of change that can happen just if more of us step up each day to live our truth. The question about I'll just go through quickly. The question about LGBTQ rights and inclusion, I feel that whenever I've participated in interfaith work and human rights work, I do bring up my Hindu faith always, because in Hindu philosophy, there is God, the divine, Brahman has no gender. So our faith, our religion, our religious heritage lends itself immediately without any calisthenics. We're just there in an inclusive space where whoever we are, whatever our gender, race, age, religion, whoever we are, in fact, whichever morsel of the universe we are one in front of God. And so we are equipped for this battle. And we must remember that. And then to the last question about Hindutva and the rise of Hindu nationalism, this is the work of Hindus for Human Rights. And I invite you to hindusforhumanrights.org to see what we are doing. We believe that this Hindu nationalism is hijacking our religion and completely decimating the Indian Constitution, for which our forefathers and mothers sacrificed, in many cases, their lives. And so this is happening on the back of Hinduism. This is why I would rather keep my Hinduism. Somebody said to me recently, keep your Hinduism in your house, don't bring it into the streets. And I said, well, an aberration of my Hinduism is being brought into the streets in a violent Islamophobic way. And so I am forced to bring my Hinduism into the streets to meet it. And so I would much rather keep it at home, but I cannot right now. And so and also in Australia right now, there are Hindu right-wing thugs who are attacking the Sikh community in Australia. You can read about it in the news. And Hindus in Australia are very alarmed, very worried, and have connected with us. And they are forming a chapter of Hindus for Human Rights in Australia. So if any of you want to join with us and expand our work, our deeply Hindu, but bold and strident human rights advocacy to South Africa, please be in touch. I'll put my email address in the chat. So thank you for the questions, and I would love to hear from my sister panelists as well, who I really appreciated.
Thank you. Perhaps, Salona, would you like to?
Sure. Thanks for the questions. Actually, the question asked by Bhuvesh, I think it was, is a very important question. Essentially, the question is, we have this wonderful constitution, and it's a hollow instrument. It does not seem to have any force or power. It's just a piece of paper, and that's often the comment, the critique that I get from my students, and so I feel somewhat prepared to answer that question because my very awoke students are constantly challenging me, and it's a wonderful thing. But the question is really about what makes people follow the law. Why do people follow the law? We have this constitution which provides a whole host of protections. We don't just have the constitution, we have quite progressive laws in place apart from the constitution, equality legislation. We have very progressive judgments from our courts, from the Constitutional Court all the way down to high courts. And so we have this legal framework in place, but that's not enough, because what makes people follow the law is more than just the law. There must be an understanding and an awareness in people that this is the right thing to do. There must be some acknowledgement in people, and this is what research shows, that the reasons why certain countries appear to be more law-abiding than others is because there's a deep awareness within the society itself, where we're coming down to the individual level, that this is the right thing to do. And what creates that is consciousness. And so that, you know, goes back to the point that was made earlier about how the role of civil society groups, faith-based groups, etc., should not be underestimated to create this bottom-up approach. So we shouldn't discard it. Of course, it means that change is slow, and that's of course very frustrating. But you know, the work of historians has shown us that actually the best time in the history of mankind to be a woman is actually right now. Women across the globe are in a far better position today than they were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, etc. And so there have been changes made. It's slow, but we have to just keep going, and we have to keep challenging ourselves. It's difficult it's difficult work, because we are trying to undo thousands of years of patriarchy. It's not going to be a quick fix. And I think we should all start from the premise that we are all a sexist, and that we all are all a racist, that we all have prejudice in us. And we should work from that point, from that place of honesty. So that's where I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Salona. Ntato, any last words from you? You need to unmute yourself.
Sure, thank you. I struggle with the constitution of this country because I think it's only as good as it's being tested. And I hear the previous point from Salona about law-abiding societies, essentially are societies who have a compact about what is the right thing to do, what is right and wrong. And I don't believe South Africa has that compact across its communities, its interest groups, and the different societies and identities. And therefore, the Constitution, you know, whenever I think about the Constitution, and in all fairness, I'm a beneficiary of the Constitution, I'm a beneficiary of democracy. I would not be here if there hadn't been a democratic transition. But at the same time, I'm so conscious that, unlike myself, many women don't have access to the means to test and to ensure their constitutional rights, which usually mean you need to have access to legal services, very expensive legal services, in order to entrench your rights, in order to enforce your rights, in order to have access to your rights. And so I think that's what raises the importance of civil society, to test the provisions of the Constitution where individuals do not, and where societies or groups do not have the resources or capacity to. I mean, an example I can give you around the perverse incentives we've got at the moment is around the Constitution and how this is linked to policymaking is I'm always challenged by the childcare grant, right? I'm challenged by the childcare grant because what it means is that taxpayers fund children. However, if you look at the Child Act, children have a right to care. There's a duty of care by parents. And the majority of children on the Child Care Act, on the Child Care Grant, are children of single mothers. And so I see a perversity here in that no one has ever challenged the Constitution or the Child Care Act or government to say, but why don't we hold fathers accountable for having children? Why is the taxpayer accountable for people who are not honoring their responsibilities towards the rights of children? And so, having grown up in exile in the United States, I must say that one of the things I valued about the US is that it's a highly litigious society, which means it's constantly testing its constitution and it's constantly testing what society sees as right and wrong. Whereas in South Africa, it's very rare that you'll get a class action case, that you'll get an interest group or women or children challenging some of these practices that are either entrenched institutionally or entrenched in policy, or entrenched, or just entrenched. We hardly ever get that challenging happening. And so I agree with you, Salona. It's going to take a very long time. On the matter of LGBTQI+, I read a very interesting article, medical article once, that actually showed that the spectrum of chromosomes, XY chromosomes in the human, in a human sample, ranged into hundreds and thousands of XY chromosome mixes, which essentially says to me that oh, please just excuse me, my alarm's gone off.
That's fun, Tato.
Which essentially says to me that, and I couldn't understand why this is not, common knowledge, and why we're not taught this in school, that actually the XX and the XY are just one of thousands of variants for human beings, and that there's so many different chromosome typologies for human beings. And so we've been niched into the idea that you only get two types of genders when you get hundreds and thousands of different chromosome variations. And that blew my mind, because that gave me a scientific understanding of why you do get an LGBTQI community, because actually the XY and the two chromosomes that make male and female are actually one of thousands variants. But for purposes of order and modernity, we've settled on two as a mean, and then have tried to conform the rest of society into this mean. And so, I think there's a lot of work to be done around continuing to research and be educated about and learn about why we do have such a diverse representation in humanity. As much as you have different ranges of skin colors and variations around culture and nationality, that's the level of variation you have around sexual orientation and gender. And in fact, my daughter, and this is why I love this generation that we're raising, because they're really unapologetic and they're not interested in any of our baggage. So my daughter one day came to me and she asked me, Mom, what is your sexual orientation? And I was like, I'm heterosexual. And she said to me, how's that possible? And I said, what do you mean? And she emailed me a link. She emailed me a link to an article that had over 36 different types of sexual orientation. Sorry, guys, are you hearing me or is it cutting?
We're hearing you. Eskom's really messed us up with load sheddings, but we know you're not representing Eskom here. Go ahead.
Yeah, so she emailed me a link to an article that had over 36 different sexual orientations. And I read this link and I realized already at the age of 40 that I grew up in my whole life and in my whole experience as a woman not understanding that I'm a sapiosexual. That I'm a person who can only be attracted to people who you're in love with, right? They've got terms for this. And I was amazed that this generation is doing the work that many of us haven't done. And they're breaking up these narrow definitions of humanity that most of us have had to conform with, and they're refusing to conform to them. And that's the most amazing part of the children that we are raising, because they're actually, I think they have a lot to teach us about how we must navigate this world from a position of humanity. I think that's how I'm going to close off my input.
Thank you very much, Ntato. Friends, we've come to the end of the webinar, and I think we've traversed a number of issues. The first one being something that Umesh is pretty passionate about. And I think, Sunita, we will discuss it and get back to you about Hindus for Human Rights. I did want to get hold of you before, but I thought it would be better that you speak first. Secondly, there is a whole call in the country, Bhuvesh, for all of us to begin to defend our democracy and defend the Constitution, especially given that the former president of this country refuses to abide by the Constitutional Court decisions and does not want to go to the Zondo Commission to provide his testimony. So we will be dealing with the issues in the Arya Samaj, and Aarti has load shedding, so she's left, but I have picked up the conversation with her about how the institution could look at how we participate in defending human rights, in promoting human rights within South Africa. And then lastly, I think both Ntato and Salona, you've been raising issues about South Africa. And I think the only way that this can really happen, where we really build a proper awareness of gender rights and the human rights in the Constitution, is if we start in each of the organizations. So we've just started the conversation and we need to continue and move on. Our next webinar will be on the 31st of March, and that webinar and the one after that on the 14th of April will be on Vedic education and spirituality. And the first one is going to be on water and the master elements. And the one in April will be on Vedic philosophy and spirituality. So friends, I think with that, I'd like to hand you over to Manita, who will get us all closed off or close the session.
Thank you, Karinapur. So that brings us to the end of this Virtual Bridge series titled Gender Rights Are Human Rights. And I want to thank the guest panelists especially. Thank you very much, Sunita Vishwanath, a Sister Desi girl. I thank you for raising your voice. Thank you to Salona Lachman. Salona, I thought your reference to Justice Pius Lange's imagery of the bridge being a journey was rather important. As has been said, you know, the legal tenets are in place, and I'm heartened at the call for Arya Samajis to activate, to introspect, and to enact change. To Ntato Mnyuku, I apologize I didn't mention you in my introduction, but thank you so very much. Your personal journey shared so very openly is really inspiring. And your description of women as society's proverbial sponges was rather revealing. But I thought that the language of misogynoir is definitely worth further exploration. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you. To the guests, to all of you wonderful participants and attendees, we thank you for spending this evening with us, for engaging. And I hope that all of you will make this more than just a talk shop. I hope that you will look within your families and your immediate circles to see how this message can be given impetus through action, through your action. The bridge will grow one brick at a time. And of course, to Karuna Mohan, thank you so very much for driving this series of extremely important conversations. I'd like to conclude, please, with the hymn of peace. May there be peace in the heavenly region and the atmosphere. May peace reign on the earth. Let there be coolness in the water. May the medicinal herbs be healing, the plants be peace-giving. May there be harmony in the celestial objects and perfection in eternal knowledge. May everything in the universe be peaceful. Let peace pervade everywhere. May that peace abide in me. May there be peace, peace, peace. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Thank you very much, everybody. Good evening.
Namaste, thank you.
Lekha, thank you very much. Hello, Lekha.
You're welcome.
You wanted to tell Sunita you want to join her?
Yes, definitely, Sunita ji. Excellent
Thanks.
work.
Thanks so much, Lekha and Sunita, Salona, if she's still on.
Yeah.
Very much from my side.